in 2019, Lenny left his job at probably one of the planet's most promising startups, which is Airbnb. And right after he left, he actually wrote a blog post that distilled what he had learned during his 7 years at Airbnb. And far from being a one-hit wonder, that was his first of many very, very popular blog posts that he's written since leaving. And he's launched a newsletter about a year ago that's now consistently kind of a top 20 Substack publication. And what I think is really remarkable about Lenny's story is that he's done something that I think a lot of the people on the call are thinking about, which is like, how do I scale my expertise? How do I write about the stuff that right now I can only help my employer with, or the handful of startups that I advise with? How do I really distill a lot of my core competencies into scalable written content that can help thousands and thousands of people? So we're going to talk about that today. But Lenny, I wanted to start at the very beginning, which is, I don't think becoming a full-time internet writer was in your life master plan. So I'm just curious, what were you planning to do early next year, or early last year, excuse me?
There's a 0% chance in my head that I would that I'd be spending this much time writing. I still can't, when I try to describe myself these days in like bios, I still can't even just say like writer. That feels that feels like very serious cognitive dissonance. I just say writing a newsletter. And so I left Airbnb about a year ago in March. I was there for about 7 years, sold my company to them in 2012. And I had kind of like plan A, start a company. Plan B, maybe do some consulting advising and make a life out of that. Plan C, join a startup as an early employee. Plan D, maybe join like a big company as a PM. And nowhere on that up to Z and beyond was like, start a newsletter. And so the way that it happened is I started thinking about, okay, if I'm starting a company, what did I learn from my time at Airbnb? I spent all this time there. Did I actually take anything away? Because I didn't like leave and like, oh, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are the things I've learned. So I started writing it down into just a doc. And then I started thinking that, okay, this is actually pretty useful. Maybe I should just share it with people. And so then I turned that into that Medium post that you mentioned that did really well. But I still had this like plan to start a company. And so I kept feeling really bad. Why am I not working on this? Why am I working on this thing? And one piece of advice I got from a friend that I really value now is just, you should actually be spending more time on things that give you energy and less time on things that sap your energy. And I was finding that the writing was giving me energy and the startup exploration was not so much. And then another piece of advice that a different friend gave me was like, okay, you found this thing that's working. These like posts seem to be valuable to people. Don't take that for granted. Don't just assume that that's like a no big deal thing that you should just push off, because that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to like, okay, stop writing, start working on a startup. And his advice just like, maybe just see where that goes. So I did that, and I essentially pivoted and stopped working on startups and started investing more into this kind of writing path just to see where it goes. So I kind of like first moved off of Medium to Substack, and then just kind of had that as a blog. And then I just decided, let me see if I could do a weekly newsletter, just like put it out there and start to see if I could do a weekly cadence. And then that started working well, and that led to the paid path eventually. And so it kind of like trickled me little by little down this path that I never thought I would have gone down.
Yeah, I'm curious too, how did you, of kind of all the things you could have written about, presumably you've seen quite a lot, both at Airbnb and since, and even before, how did you kind of decide like, what of the things I know a lot about is even worth putting into writing and kind of starting to build my, brand around, if you will?
So the first things were just things that like wanted to get out of my head. They're just like, oh, I have this thing. I just want to like write it down and just get it out before I forget it. So that was the beginnings. So I just had this like thing coming out of me that I just wanted to get out. 2 is with the newsletter. Here's a trick. If you do an advice column newsletter, people send you topics to write about all the time because that's problems they're having. And so that gives me a huge backlog of things that I should be writing about, because if nothing else, it's useful to one person. So that helped a lot. And I was inspired by, I think her name's Julie Zhu from Facebook, who had kind of this, a similar blog newsletter around design. And that kind of inspired me to do this around more product and growth. So that turned out to be a really good idea. So those are 2 things that give me things to write about. 3 is just things I'm just like curious about. Sorry if you can hear my dog in the background. Things that I just want to learn, that I'm just curious about, that I want to explore, and this is just a good excuse to learn it. Like, people are going to value this thing and I'm going to learn about it. So things I'm curious. Then just like things that resonate on Twitter, when I tweet something that people seem to really like. For example, I did this tweet thread around how to do performance reviews, and it got a lot more attention than I thought. And so that inspired me to do a deeper dive around that kind of thing. And the thing that I'm trying to be careful about as much as possible is you can easily get pulled into doing things that other people want you to do and write about things other people want you to write about. But I find the more interested I am in a thing I'm working on, the better it gets. And so I try to stay close to like just writing things I'm really interested in with a bit of the input of what other people are looking for, but not fall for just write only what things people are asking you to write about. Because then you just end up with like a job that you don't like again. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's the ultimate challenge of an entrepreneur is like, oh crap, I just reinvented a job for myself with even more responsibility and more pressure.
Exactly.
So I'm curious, like you mentioned something that I thought was really cool in a conversation you had with Nathan Bishez and Lee Jin a couple of weeks ago, which is that I think there's often this sense, right? You're not the first person to write about performance reviews. You're not the first person to write about marketplaces or product management. And yet a lot of what you've written has just really resonated with kind of a huge number of people. And something you mentioned is like in the beginning, you're maybe a little concerned around, crap, am I going to run out of stuff to write about? Like, has this surface area been covered of these topics? But that now maybe you have a different mindset. So I'm curious to hear you maybe elaborate on what you meant by that.
So the question is just like, how do I feel like I'm not going to run out of stuff? And just, I've learned
totally
I can always find things to write about. So one is just doing it for a long time. So I started this initial newsletter as just, I like tweeted, like I'm going to experiment with a newsletter to have no pressure and no commitment. And just doing that every week for 9 months before I switched to paid gave me confidence that like, hey, I did this for 9 months and I have like this long list of other things I want to write about. So it's probably likely that I'll have a lot of things that I could continue writing about. So one is just doing it. And I don't think there's any way to shortcut that. I think each person just kind of has to build that confidence in themselves by just doing it for a while. And then the other thing is, if you just look at the stuff I've written about, it's just like crazy. Nobody has written about these things or has not written about them really well. And so if you just look at the stuff I've written about, like how to start a consumer app and how to get your first few customers, or how to launch a B2B business, or how to get into product management, or like the best PM templates. These are just like really basic questions that I just like am continually surprised that they're not already out there. Or they're out there, but they're just like not great. People, and I think this comes down to people just don't have a lot of time to write. And so if you actually have time to write, you will innately write better things. And so most people just kind of put something out there because they have just a little bit of time and they just want to do it and it sounds good enough. So the thing I focus on is just like make sure it's really valuable and really high quality as much as possible, because there's not a lot of that out there. And again, it just comes down to if you have time to write, you're going to stand out. There's a direct correlation between the posts that take the most time and how much people value them and how well they do.
Yeah, and that's something that that we've talked a lot about internally at Compound, which is like, unfortunately, no growth hacks in the world will save you if your stuff's ultimately not great. And that's kind of the ultimate hack, if you will. And I'm curious, a lot of your growth, my understanding is that it has been word of mouth, and people really do find this value in, they're working through the same problems that you've kind of written about. So how do you think about quality, and how do you almost think about setting a bar for yourself of what's worthy of shipping, of what's good enough to ship, of what really articulates the solution in a way that maybe hasn't been said before? I'm just curious how you think about putting together something that is definitively good enough to kind of publish.
Yeah. It's hard to put into very concrete terms, but what I find is, one is I always come back to, is this actually going to be useful for somebody? Like if they're a PM at a company, are they going to read this thing and actually be able to use it on their team now, versus just like fuzzy, superficial, kind of high level stuff that a lot of people on Medium especially just have all these really fuzzy kind of ideas. I also personally, I try to avoid pontificating on things, and I try to focus on just like concrete, actionable things you can do and examples and those kinds of things. So that's just like always in the back of my mind. Is this actually useful to somebody? And then in terms of how I know if something's ready, I basically just read through it probably 10 or 20 times on the computer and my phone. And once I find that I don't have a lot of changes that I want to make, I stop catching typos, or I stop feeling like I can move things around and add things and remove things. Once there's enough of those, like, okay, there's only a couple things this time I went through it, tells me that it's basically ready. And I find that actually looking at it on a different device is really important. I think it kind of tricks your brain into seeing things again for the first time. And every time I send it to my phone and look at it, I'm just like shocked by how many things I missed and how many typos it still has. And so I kind of go back and forth between those two. So that's kind of the way I think about it.
Yeah, I'm curious too. Like when you go to write something, another thing that we think a lot about is like sometimes writing is the means by which you share your ideas, and you already have the ideas fully formed, and you just need to communicate them. And then sometimes writing is the way that you think, and you realize how little you knew when you first started writing something. So I'm curious to hear if you've had that experience of learning what you didn't know about things like product management, marketplaces, et cetera, all the topics that you cover by writing about them now that you've dedicated more time into writing. Do you use it as a way of thinking, in other words?
200%. That's what got me started, is to remember these things that I've learned. And then it's a lot of what keeps me going is I think people may think that I know all these things that I'm writing about as I write about them, but it's mostly an excuse to actually learn it and learn it better, and then to crystallize it and make it really easy to consume. And so, yeah, it's like, I don't know, 80% me learning about these things as I write about them. Even just like thinking back to the thing that I did and what I found work is just like a way for me to learn, oh yeah, this is a way you could do that in the future. So it's a great excuse to have like a newsletter you have to write every week to actually learn about a lot of things. And some of my posts are these kind of deep dive research posts, and those are the ones where I probably learn the most, because I end up talking to a lot of founders and PMs and growth people and actually learn directly from them. So 200%.
Yeah, and I love that, because I think probably you have a lot of hunches that lead you in a certain direction, but you start to maybe uncover what you didn't know in the process of putting together one of these pieces. I'm really curious of the work for you that gets shared pretty widely and really seems to resonate most with your readers. Have you noticed any similarities in what types of essays and blog posts, what kind of format seems to really resonate with folks?
So at the base layer, again, I'd say it's just like things that are concretely valuable to people that they can take and use, and not just a bunch of fuzzy ideas. 2 is, again, it's just directly correlated with the amount of time I put into it. So the marketplace series that I did, where it was like an 8-part series on how to start a marketplace business, was at least 100 hours of work over the course of a few months. And I think that was my most popular post. And at least initially, it was the source of a lot of my growth. And then it's just like, I don't know, what questions do you keep hearing people ask, either on Twitter or directly to you? And I find that the more times you hear a question being asked, the more likely people really value the answer. So some of those things. And I guess another is just the more it's like a framework of a thing, where it's like how B2B companies kickstart, where it's like a visual, easy to understand concept that always felt very vague. That seems to do really well.
Yeah, another thing that I thought was really cool with your background, how you've done a lot of your writing, is like there seems to be a pretty tight feedback loop between you and your readers. And I certainly don't get the impression that you send this thing out, shut the laptop, and don't check Twitter for a week. You're kind of actively engaging with readers. And we think a lot about the impact of feedback on, how an internet writer can really make sure they're always chasing down something interesting. So I'm curious to hear a bit how the feedback you've received from your readers, maybe about the topics you write about the things they want to learn more about, how that's helped inform your decisions about kind of what to do next.
I'd say the main reason I engage is I just find it interesting and fun, and it's not like any kind of strategy of any sort. And then in terms of the way the feedback has informed what I do, being an advice column kind of format innately, I'm just getting questions from people regularly. And so that informs a lot of what I end up writing. I wish I had a group like this that just like I could run every post by and just like make sure it could be even better. But I don't currently. So it's just like me. Like my wife would never want to look at anything I'm writing. She'd just like, leave me alone. I don't want to spend time with this. But that would help for sure. But I don't have that. And then, once it's out, often there's like comments like, hey, here's a thing you could add, or here's a thing you got wrong. And then I often end up putting it in afterwards or including it in a follow-up post or something like that.
Yeah. And I'm curious. It's so funny to think about, you opened up with saying that like following your energy is this kind of framework for a lot of things in life, choosing which project to work on next, but also within writing, write about the thing you're going to be most excited to go through the arduous process of writing about it. I'm curious, do you think about like a strategy for the newsletter and like which areas of your expertise you're like only kind of exclusively going to write about? Is that kind of a conscious decision you're making? Or is it really driven by this curiosity?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot. I think the classic advice is pick a really straightforward niche and just become really good at that. And if I was smart, I'd pick like just product management or just growth or just startups. But I don't want to be just spending all my time on one of those things. I'm just like not interested in any of those so deeply where I would just want to only think about that all the time. So I very specifically am trying to keep this broad area that I think about because I'm just like interested in all of it. And so with that, I have this like strange mix of people. And I always think about, I need to like intersperse content for each of those groups regularly because it's a weekly newsletter. And if you don't see anything that's useful to you for probably 3 weeks, you just like, what am I doing here? And you churn. So the main thing I think about is alternating a growth topic with a product topic with just like startup business stuff and then just general leadership. That's the main thing I struggle with / think about.
Yeah, that's an interesting one too, because I think folks on the call might have a background in law or software engineering, or they might even be a doctor or something, and they probably but they also might have many other curiosities that really might kind of run the spectrum, run the gamut. And I'm curious, with the topics you write about, do you think that people are willing to pay because it can help them be better at their day job, and it's kind of easy to justify becoming a paid reader of yours, or is that another thing that like almost part of it is just entertainment value and they really enjoy reading your insights? I think a lot of people are thinking through, what could I write about that people would actually kind of give me money for?
Yeah, I'd say the way you should think about that is just like, what's interesting to you is number one, because it's probably going to be interesting to other people. And I think when you're writing on things you're interested in, genuinely curious about stuff, people are there's a much higher chance people are also going to be interested in that. And the content is going to be good. And then the other, I always think about Brian Armstrong from Coinbase has this really interesting point that he made where when he thought about the company Coinbase, which is this Bitcoin marketplace kind of broker company, he's like, there's very few people in the world that can start a company like this. And the fact that he has an engineering background and an economics background and a cryptography background, I think those are the three. Like there's a lot of people in each of those buckets, but there's very few people that are really good at all three of those things. And so what I think about is what are the combination of things that you're really good at? And there's probably a very small group that's really good at all three of those things or two of those things. And so is there something there that's enough people would be interested in? And I think it's okay if it's a combination of things because sometimes there's overlaps amongst those audiences.
Yeah, I love that. Kind of the triple threat model. There's been a lot of that. Mark Andreessen wrote a great post about it. And the idea of creating your skill salad, if you will, and like some really interesting things can live at those intersections. So in a couple minutes, we'll get to the Q&A. So there's already some questions kind of lighting up in here. So feel free if anything else has come up. to type them
it's
in.
not ground.
Oh, and make sure you're on mute, Kevin. I think we have an accidental guest contributor. People are rushing to the Q&A. So anyway, start typing in the chat as anything else comes to mind. But another cool thing that I've seen you start to do and play around with is creating more of a formal community around your writing. And now you have an audience of a certain scale where maybe that's much more doable. So I'm curious maybe what your thinking is behind actually launching a group of your readers, putting them in a Slack group and kind of getting to know them better. Just curious how you're thinking about that project.
This is another thing that, like, looking back, it's like, oh, that was smart. But when I did it, it was a very random kind of thing that led me to it. And where it came from initially is I was launching the paid newsletter. And I was like, man, $15 a month, that's like a lot to ask for just like some writing. So what else can I offer people just to like give them more reason to subscribe? So I just added, we'll invite you to a private community. And so I just included that in my initial launch. And then I was like, a few months later, I was like, oh man, I got to do that. So I just looked at a bunch of community tools, decided to go Slack, and then launched it, invited 10, 20 people initially just to kind of get it going. And now it's something like 600 people. And kind of the idea there is, if I think about it a little more high level, is just my philosophy is just brings awesome people together and just hope good things happen. And it seems to be working so far. I don't spend a lot of time moderating or managing it. It's very self-sufficient at this point. And I think my lesson there is, if you have a group of people that are awesome, just bring them together digitally, if nothing else, and good things seem to happen.
We definitely agree with you there. Cool. So I think we'll go into the Q&A so we can kind of stay on track here. And I'm going to do my best to start from the top. So I think, Max, if you are able to unmute, feel free to lead with your question. Let's see, Max Lowenthal, you there? Otherwise, I'll ask it. Oh, cool. Mic troubles. Cool. No sweat. I will be the translator here. So Max had a question around, are there ever scenarios where leading with personal interest to decide topics has backfired on you, where maybe your curiosities were not shared with your readers?
Mm-hmm. I guess I wrote this post. I went on this silent meditation retreat, and I wrote this post about what Buddhism taught me about product management. And it was like so powerful for me. And it was so clear and so useful, but I don't think a lot of people resonated with that. But that's okay. And it didn't matter.
Yeah, actually, I'm curious about that. How much do you ever think about, like, if something just kind of flops or doesn't get the reaction you were hoping for, does it really matter? Do you sweat it? I'm just curious, because I think that's an anxiety. Yeah, it's an anxiety shared by a lot of people.
Yeah, no, it never feels good. Like when I look at the open rates for certain emails, I'm like, shit, that didn't resonate. But I find that it doesn't happen consistently, and then I get over it pretty quickly as soon as the next email goes out. So I guess the thing to look for, is it consistently being a problem, or is it just a one-off thing? And so far, one time not being that successful has not had any impact. Like there wasn't like a massive set of unsubscribes or anything like that. It's always, I think people give you a chance, at least like 2 or 3 chances in a row.
Totally. Yeah. If you can win them once, they're willing to hang around for a few more swings. Yeah. Cool. So Tom White, if you're able to unmute, you're welcome to ask your question. Otherwise, I'm happy to MC here.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah.
Loud and clear.
Hey, Lenny, thanks for taking some time to chat with us. Big fan. So I'm kind of growing my newsletter, a couple hundred subscribers, so orders of magnitude lower than where you are. But what percentage of your time do you focus on your products? That is to say your writing versus distribution, which is to say growth and dissemination and engaging with, Reddit or Hacker News or any other kind of channels. And again, I have a quote that like kind of is in the back of my mind. First time founders care about the product. Second time founders care most about distribution. And I wonder how kind of germane that is and how you think about that.
That same tweet came up in a different talk that I was doing. And I always worry about people taking these tweets as like literal truth. I think that was just like someone's random comment, and I don't know if that's true, to be honest. That description of founders. So that's just a side note. But to answer your question, I spend very little time on distribution. Partly because I find that the better the writing, the more it spreads, and most of the growth has been word of mouth. And so I spend all my time basically on the writing. And then I've kind of experimented with like Twitter ads and reaching out to groups to kind of give them discounts. And I guess you could say Twitter is kind of a distribution channel. And so I do spend time on Twitter. So if that counts, then I spend a lot of time on it. But otherwise, I try to focus on the writing as much as I can. And I always have this push to just spend more and more time on the writing and push out other things, because I feel like the better your content is, the more people will talk about it and share with their friends and subscribe. And so I think like 90% of my growth is just word of mouth, people sharing it with each other. And so I think if you're spending a lot of time on growth, something's off about the content most likely, or you just don't have any sort of distribution channel like Twitter or Reddit or anything like that. That's a different problem.
Yeah, I actually had a follow on there about obviously your first post that you shared after Airbnb, where you distilled everything you had learned while at Airbnb. I think you shared on Medium, which can be great if you're kind of bootstrapping an audience, but does that kind of what supercharged the launch of the Substack? Is that how you got your first X readers? Just curious to hear if there was kind of an inflection point for you.
I think the main thing that helped with getting the newsletter started is I started sharing just nuggets of value on Twitter that was either coming from these Medium posts or just things that I didn't want to turn into a whole post. So I think it always comes back to just provide value for people, and they're going to want to follow you, subscribe to what you're doing, pay attention to what you're doing. So with Twitter, I just started putting out things that I found valuable for myself, and other people found it. And so I built up followers on Twitter by just doing that. And then when I launched the newsletter, I tweeted that there's a newsletter that you guys should follow. So that got me my first 500 subscribers. So I think the lesson there is just find places to add value to people's lives, and then you'll build an audience there over time. It takes time. And then you can direct that audience to other things like your newsletter.
Yeah, and just one other follow-up there. I'm curious with some of the topics you write about. Presumably there's companies out there that might even like expense, a lot of your stuff's very useful for people to just get better at doing their work. So I'm curious, is that at all a strategy? Do you notice like companies internally sharing your work and encouraging people to sign up?
Yeah, in my emails, I even encourage people to expense it. So it's very much a strategy. The problem I run into, though, is people that can't expense it then feel less good about subscribing, because then it feels like, oh shit, I can't expense it. So I try to straddle the line of like, if you can expense it, amazing. If not, don't worry about it. Just might still be worth it. And then, yeah, people share it in companies all the time. And I haven't done anything with like, hey, you should buy more subscriptions because you have a lot of people reading it. But I don't want to focus. I just don't want to spend time on that at this point. I don't think it's worth it. And then when I look at like Ben Thompson with Stratechery, I think he has the same problem where people just subscribe once and distribute it to everyone in the company, and he's doing fine. So not spending time there.
Yeah, totally. The OG of the paid newsletters. Cool. So I think, Omid, if you're able to unmute, feel free. Otherwise, I'll ask your question.
Hey, thanks too. Thanks, Lenny, for joining. Your initial posts on how to thrive in product management was like super helpful in getting me into product management, and I like continue to reference it. And people who ask me how to shift in, like I always point them to it. So, if nothing else in this world, I want to thank you for your contribution to my life. I was curious to know, like, so a lot of your writing is more long form, and like you might even have like multiple posts like on a topic. I'm curious like how you think about chopping some of that up into micro content that you can have like, share the same stuff for tweet storms and things like that. How do you kind of balance writing long form versus short form? Yeah, that's actually a really good question, because I find that there's a lot of value in repurposing the time that I put into my writing in other places like Twitter. So at this point, I start with a post, and
I have a problem of going too long on these posts. I often hit like the Gmail limit of how long a post can be, and I have to kind of work my way backwards from that, which I don't think is a good strategy, but I just can't help myself. And so I write that post, and then I always tweet it. And so when I tweet it, when it goes out, I try to think of what's like a valuable independent nugget that I can include from that post that can live on its own as much as possible. So I either pull out like a cool story or an image or something like that. Rarely does it work the other way where I tweet something and then turn it into posts. I think that's like 10% of the things I write. So the way to think about it is just, okay, you've done all this work coming up with this whole breadth of information. How do you extract some nuggets from it and share it in other places like Twitter? And Twitter is just like so great for at least my audience. I don't know if that applies to all the kinds of things you guys are thinking about writing about, but it just feels like everyone's there and they're looking for value. And it's just like the constraint is really nice because you just have to, you force yourself to put out a very simple thought that is easy to consume. And then I often try to do tweet threads where there's just like a bunch of information that's more reason for people to share it and save it.
Wonderful. Yeah, great question. It's funny. There's so much like medium specific writing where, Twitter is great for like distilling, whereas a longer form piece, you can really go deep on some stuff. Cool. Josh Mitchell, if you are able to unmute, you are next in line.
Yes, sir.
Awesome. Take it away.
Cool. Hey, Letty.
Hey, Josh.
So my question is, what are some do things that don't scale distribution strategies? And what I mean by that is, whenever I'm hunting for things to write about, if I don't have anything in particular in mind, usually like I'll look at big high follower count Twitter people and then see what questions people are asking them. Or you can do a good old like SEO style keyword search and see what has high volumes and stuff. But if you're feeling particularly impatient, are there even more like in your face kind of non-scaling distribution strategies? Like, what do you think about like literally messaging people and saying, hey, I think you should read this because I think you would find it valuable? Like maybe doing that for people with big follower accounts or not big follower accounts, or, just like what, if you're just impatient, what's your advice there?
I think that's fine. Although innately people will doubt that it's great because they haven't come across it themselves. And usually if something's amazing, they'll just kind of see it pop up in their feeds and things. So I think there's always going to be a default like, I doubt it. But if it is actually amazing, then that's a really good way of getting in front of them for sure. In terms of just like things that don't scale as distribution, I did have a lot of luck and success with just like people with lots of followers on Twitter sharing my stuff early on. And I think most of it just came from, hey, they found it really valuable and they were excited about sharing it. It wasn't me trying to encourage them too much. But that was really powerful. Just like create moments where there's like a reason for a bunch of important people to share it on Twitter, where it becomes like, oh, wow, look at Josh's stuff. I'm seeing it everywhere. That helps a lot. So like when I launched my newsletter, I did that. I kind of just like seeded it with people that had a bunch of followers that people respect and just told them, hey, I'm going to launch my newsletter on this day. If you're into it, I'd love for you to share it. And it worked really well. So that was really effective. And yeah, I guess like the idea of answering someone's question in your post, I would just be careful of again, writing things that you're not actually interested in and just doing things because you think people want to read it. As much as possible, I would stick to just like, what are you curious about that you want to answer for yourself? Because I find that does better.
Cool. Thanks.
Awesome. Great question. Sara, you are next in line if you're able to unmute.
Yep, I'm here.
Awesome.
Hey, Lenny, thanks for doing this. This is really helpful. I'm curious about your thoughts on Substack as a long-term platform. I've actually been on it for a couple of years now, somehow found them really early on. But the more I do it, the more I'm like, do I want it all to live on somebody else's platform? So just wanted to get your thoughts there.
Yeah, it's a very nuanced, deep question that I think about often. So the advantage I have is they gave me this custom domain. And so with that, the SEO downside is less so, where it's already, I can transfer it in theory to a different place with all the same URLs, and the SEO juice won't disappear. Because that's one of the main concerns I would have if you don't have that. And that's a real problem for sure. Like the thing I love about Substack is I just don't have to think about anything else, and I just write and it's just working. And there's always this option to switch in the future if I really wanted to. And so I don't feel like I need to make any sort of immediate decision. That's where I always come back to. And I also haven't seen, I don't know if your newsletter's paid, Sarah, or not, but I haven't seen anyone paid to actually switch off of Substack, but I imagine it'll happen at some point. The other thing is that their whole strategy is to make that 10% that they charge worth it to you by giving you more and more services over time. And it's actually happening. I'm talking with them about some cool stuff. So I think that's going to be the question, is especially if you're paid, is that 10% worth it? Because like at scale, that's like a lot of money. That's like a lot more than you would pay for any email platform anywhere in the world.
Yeah. I think for me, I haven't turned on paid yet, but there's a possibility that I won't, because I'm also pursuing different avenues of revenue. So
got it.
Yeah, that's good to know that they're planning more stuff though. Cause right now I'm kind of like, I don't know, if you're you, I get it. For the smaller people, it's like, I don't know.
What else would you use?
I just had an interesting conversation with another person about maybe switching over to ConvertKit, and
yeah.
And especially if you're going to sell like courses or books or anything like that, that probably makes more sense.
Yeah, I think that does make more sense. I think you just have to, like, there'll be an added percentage of your time that you're spending on just maintaining it and building it and making it great that will cut away from writing time. But I don't know how much that ends up being. That's the question. But I guess the TLDR is I've been really happy with Substack. It's just like as a life path, I would not have been anywhere where I am now without Substack existing. So I'm kind of just like loyal to them at this point. And again, it just gives me time to write versus other things. But it is a really important question, because once you're on there and all the SEO is flowing to that domain, it's hard to recapture that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I probably, sorry, I'm talking a lot because I know there's no more questions, but I think for me also, like I've been writing professionally for a long time now. And one of the biggest regrets I have is that I didn't start building my email list earlier. So there's a little bit of that just informing, being like, am I going to feel this way about keeping stuff on Substack, even though I get to take the emails this time?
Right. Yeah. So if you're not worried about the SEO as much and just the email list, then that's a reason to stay on Substack, because it's so easy.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks. So we do have, fresh one in. Josh, jump in. I've got a few from folks who are not able to actually make the call. So that'll definitely keep us busy to the end. But Josh, you are on the line. So do your thing.
All right. Fair enough. So my question is, as far as starting an email list goes, I'm like you pre-commitment, and I'm terrified of the idea of saying, all right, I'm going to start an email list. And from now on till the end of time, every week, I better have something that ends up in the email box of other people, and it better be valuable. And that's terrifying to me. And I'm wondering, do you think that you just got to suck it up because that's how it goes? Or is there possibly some other way you can phrase your value proposition in such a way that you can maintain that flexibility?
Is yours paid?
No.
So if it's not paid, like imagine going to paid, that's when it gets really real. Now I have to write every week forever because people are paying me for like yearly plans that extend forever basically now. And so that's when it gets real. So my advice is just like tell people I'm experimenting. I'm going to do an experiment. I'm going to try a weekly newsletter. We'll see how it goes. And just try that. And no one's going to be like, oh, where'd that email go? I missed it this week. Like no one remembers when they got your last email. They don't want more email necessarily. And so don't worry too much about it. Just set it up as an experiment, or just like, I'm tinkering with this concept. Let's see how it goes. And then just do it for like 3 months and see if you can keep it up.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great question. someone said yesterday, I forget if it was Cedric or Packy or somebody, that don't worry, nobody's going to read your stuff in the beginning. And I thought that was really funny because I'm like, yeah, totally. Because I had a lot of the same anxiety around starting to put myself out there. So yeah, I'm also not paid though, so the pressure's artificial. So we did have some questions from the group who were not able to make it. And this one actually ties in really well with your theme around quality. I think what I've consistently heard you say, if there's a couple themes throughout the call today, one is write about the stuff you really have some energy around and some curiosity and intrinsic motivation around. And the other is like, make the damn thing good. Like it just has to be good. That's the way that it gets shared. That's why folks share your stuff. So the question is around your kind of research process for the more in-depth posts. Marketplace post might be a good example. And how you've gone about creating these very usable, like information dense posts. So I'm just curious, and the question is around like, how do you do your research for these big posts, and kind of what advice would you give for people thinking about kind of doing an in-depth piece of content like that?
Yeah. So before I get into that, just to add to the point you made about how it has to be good, the reason that it has to be good is there's so much content out in the world, and it's so much free content that the only way you stand out is you're better than all of those other ones. Like not just a little bit better, but it's like, oh, wow, this is so good. And so that's why it's so important to focus so much on something really good and not just good enough, because you'll just get ignored. So then going to the research post. So the way I do it is like, okay, here's a question I want to answer. So in this case, how does a marketplace business start? How do you start a marketplace business? And the reason I came to that is I left Airbnb and people kind of just started asking me, hey, how did Airbnb do this? How did they start here? What was the right thing they did here? And I just felt like, man, I have this one experience and here's what they did. Happy to tell you. But like, that doesn't mean it's going to work for everybody. It doesn't mean that's like the key to their success. It could be all these other random things. And so I just wanted a better answer to share with people. And so the first thing I did, and I do this with all the research posts, is let me just make a list of all the companies I want to talk to. That would be awesome to include in this story. Just make a list and then figure out a person at each of these companies that I can talk to, and then basically find a warm introduction to them. Get connected to them and then just like ask them the question. So for example, for the B2B startup post, like how did you get your first 10 customers? I just asked them all that same question over email. I don't do any Zooms with them because I try to keep their time really limited, like the amount of time I'm asking. And then I just throw it all up into a big doc in Coda and just put them all in there. And then I just stare at it basically for a while until there's kind of a pattern that starts to emerge, or a framework or consistency of how they did it. Either it's like step 1, 2, 3, they all did this thing, or it's, oh, some did the X, some did Y, some did Z. And eventually it just starts to kind of form a story. And then it's just a matter of visualizing it and then telling the story in writing in a way that people don't get overwhelmed with. So trying to keep it structured and simple and focused. So that's the steps. Basically, here's the question: who do I want to talk to about this? And then just find a way to talk to them and just keep bugging people and finding a way in. Like I was trying to get to the CEO of Slack, which I haven't gotten to yet, but they just like their PR team just got tired of me trying to get to him apparently. Apparently they think I already talked to him. So they're like, we're not going to give you any more time with him. It's like, I never talked to him. But that's how you get to this stuff. And eventually people seem to be really helpful and wanting to share. Like you think people would be so secretive and not interested in sharing all these insights, but they're really excited about telling their story. And as long as you give them rights to edit it, to review it before it goes out and not have anything go out that they're not cool with, it's not that hard. And then it's just time. It just goes back to putting in the time.
We've got two more questions that are maybe somewhat along these lines. But the first is when you've actually kind of gone and you've got your 100 answers or whatever the data looks like, and you're now starting to cobble it together, you're seeing some themes, you're maybe starting to put the scaffolding up for a post. The question is just around like, what does your actual editing process look like? Is it typically you just letting it sit for a day, going back to it the next day? Do you have editors you work with? What's kind of the process once you have that first crude draft together?
I just look at it many times, again and again. And kind of like what I talked about, I just kind of read through it over and over as I'm writing it. And then as I'm finishing it, I just kind of keep reading through it and finding ways to make it better, like removing words. I have the book on writing well right next to my chair that I use for writing usually. And I just kind of open it up randomly to remind myself of like, just cut more shit, just cut all these words, just stop writing things, make it shorter, remove adjectives and adverbs and all that stuff. And so it's just like rethinking about all those things and then just reading through it over and over and over, looking at it on my phone, seeing things I didn't see, cutting it again, moving things around. So that's kind of it. And then I started keeping this list of just like ways to just like high level rules. So it's like, I always think about, is this interesting? Is there a story I could add? Is there stuff I could cut? I even have this list somewhere here, but I always try to come back to those when I can, but I often forget. Writing. Yeah. I also try to think about it as honest. I think a lot of people like to say things that sound good and sound as smart. And I find that the best stuff is always coming back to like, did I actually experience this? Do I actually believe this is true? And can I get more real with it? For example, I'm doing a post right now about how to improve retention for a company. And I'm trying to get to like, there's all these like stories of things that people have done, but I'm trying to get to concrete stats and numbers and real things that have worked, not just, I did this thing and it felt really good. So I try to think about those things as I'm going through it over and over.
Yeah, that's a great topic that I think there is a lot of, I think it was like the Paul Graham essay where it's like, it's easy to make something sound good by making it vague. And I think that's like a really big temptation around giving advice or sharing maybe like stuff that the writer might be more concerned about looking good versus being as useful as possible. Because sometimes being useful is just messy or overly simple or like almost just like not terribly nice sounding.
Right.
So I actually love that question of like, is this honest? If I read this, would I actually find it useful? Could I go act on it? Is that kind of what you mean? Is this really?
It's more from like internally, like, do I believe this? And have I seen this to be true in practice? Or do I buy what this story I hear is telling? Like sometimes you get quotes from founders and it sounds kind of like a PR pitch versus like what actually happened. So I always try to push on like, okay, is this really what worked? Or is there other things that may have worked better? Did this actually make a big impact? Because there's so much of this just like myth out there of what works for companies. And I'm trying to get to the real truth. The other thing you just reminded me of, another tip that I've learned with both Twitter and writing, it's kind of unrelated, but I think valuable. People often think that like they want to like lead up to something important and like tell a kind of have a big introduction and get people like into the whole thing. And then eventually you reveal the nuggets and the gold of the post. And I find that that's the opposite of what works. The more you give away all your goods from the post immediately, and especially on Twitter, the more you just give away all the good stuff quickly, the better it does. Because to your point, nobody's going to read it normally. And if anything, they'll read the beginning. And then they're like, oh, wow, this is cool. And then they read more because of that. So especially on Twitter, people often like, oh, here's a story I wrote, go read it. So what I do is just like, no, okay, here's all the most useful things from this post right on Twitter. Enjoy it. And then that often leads to like, oh, wow, this is really good. I'm going to go read the whole thing and then subscribe.
Yeah, it's like, don't assume there's more of an attention span than maybe there is.
Exactly.
And be like, here's the goods.
No one's
Are
like,
you interested?
This could be good. I guess I'll click it and see what's in there. Like, no.
Yeah, I've got 1,000 words I can read through before I get something interesting.
Right.
That's great advice. So cool. I think that segues perfectly into the final question here, which is if you were just kind of starting from scratch, there are a lot of folks who have been writing either kind of privately forever or maybe just haven't invested the time in trying to do it more publicly. So I'm just curious if you were kind of starting again from scratch, launching your newsletter, starting to publish more frequently online. Do you just have any advice that you'd give to yourself, 12 months ago, whenever you really started going after it?
One that comes to mind is initially when I started my newsletter, I was answering 3 questions every week because I wanted it to be so full of value But what I find now that if I'm doing it every week forever, in theory, I have to keep it sustainable, and I need to always have more coming in the future. And so what I've learned is even if I could do more and include more topics, I shouldn't, because I should save those for the future, because you just basically have to keep this sustainable. So I don't actually know how people do like a daily newsletter like Ben Thompson. I don't understand how that's possible. Like I could barely do a really good weekly post. And the way I do that is I try not to give it all away in one post. I try to stick to just one topic. That's one. Just like think about this sustainable path for the way you write. Like a daily newsletter is very hard. And I find people don't want more email. Like you would think a daily newsletter is more valuable than a weekly newsletter. But I find people don't really want more email, and weekly is often a really good cadence. So that's one. Two is I probably should have gotten paid sooner. I feel like I waited longer than I should have, but it all worked out. But the only reason I actually finally went paid is COVID hit. And I was like, man, I need to start earning some income again. And so I was like, all right, I guess it's time. Let's do this thing. And it worked out. And so I should have gone sooner. So I think my lesson there is don't be afraid to switch to paid earlier. On the other hand, I think it was really valuable to have a pretty big free base when I launched. So don't do too early either. Just right.
Well, totally. Well, we're coming up right on time. I want to thank everyone who carved out an hour of their day to join us. We will send out the recording afterwards for anybody who missed it, and obviously for the folks on the call. But Lenny, I can't thank you enough for sharing the wisdom from the past 12 months with this group. I know I have literally 4 pages of notes in front of me. So thank you so much for, yeah, right. Totally. The 7 things I learned about learning from Lenny.
That's right. Yeah. Thanks for having me. This is great. I love what you guys are doing here.
Appreciate it. And hope to see you again. And thanks again for all the wisdom. I hope we'll do a round 2 at some point.
I'm in.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks everybody.
Bye everyone. Good luck.
See y'all.